Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise on C-49. Now, as I've mentioned in this House, I've had the pleasure of living across the country from one side to the other, from Victoria to northern Alberta to actually in Newfoundland for a while. So C-49 hits a tiny bit close for me, so I'm very pleased to speak on it. Now, to sum up Newfoundland, my experience was this. One day in Edmonton, when I was outdoor knocking, first campaign in 2015, a lot of Newfoundlanders live in my riding of Edmonton West, or as I call it, Edmonton West, Edmonton Mall. And there was a couple that were in their garage. It was a hot day. The garage door was open. They were sitting having a beer inside their garage, and we start chatting. And it's like, oh, you're from Newfoundland. I used to live in St. John's. So did they. We start chatting. They invite me to have a beer. I sit down with them. We have a nice beer together. A couple years later, it was during the horrible forest fires in Fort McMurray, and of course a lot of people from Newfoundland were living there, evacuated, and this couple had taken in a couple from Fort McMurray who also were Newfoundlanders. And I was at an event one night at the Good Shepherd Church. It was a fundraising event, and I ran into this couple, and they had introduced me to this other couple who they were housing, complete strangers, but because they were Newfoundlanders, they were happy to take in another couple. And we started chatting, and they said, oh, they were from St. John's. And I said, well, I used to live there. Whereabouts? And I said, well, I used to live off on Binden Street. And it turns out they were my former neighbors. They lived in the lot behind mine. And, sorry.
It's getting out in here. I'm asking members who are having conversations to please step out of the chamber to do that. And there's conversations going on both sides, so I just want to remind members to please take their conversations out. The honour member for Edmonton West.
Thanks. And as I was saying, it turns out this couple had lived right behind our house. And back then, if anyone's ever lived in St. John's, they know they have very lovely winters with lots of snow. And the first year I lived there, we had 22 feet of snow, record amount of snow. It wasn't until June I found out we actually had an 8-foot fence in our backyard. So they were laughing, well, we were the couple behind you. And I had to laugh because at the time we had this beautiful dog named Doonesbury, world's greatest dog. And he would wander on these huge snowbanks from yard to yard to yard, because of course, way above the fence. And it turns out he had often visited their yard to do his business. So it was years later I had the opportunity to apologize for my dog. Now, there's a few things I note about people from Newfoundland, that you really never leave the rock. I worked in Fort McMurray for a while, and we actually had the largest club at the time was called the Newfoundland Club. And everyone I met up in Fort McMurray all had the same wish. They wanted to go back home and be able to work at home in good jobs. And of course, they weren't available, which is why they were in Fort McMurray. When I lived in Newfoundland, every time I traveled to the mainland or away, usually Nova Scotia where our regional office was, I always noted whenever I flew back to St. John's, I'd land about midnight, get into the airport, and there was always about 50 to 60, 70 people, families, holding up signs, walking back, their family, mostly coming from Alberta for work. Now, since taking over this job 9 years ago, I've probably returned to Edmonton Airport probably 300 to 400 times, and I know not once has anyone been waiting there for me with a sign. But Newfoundlanders, it was always that. It was quite amazing. Beautiful city. I enjoyed my time living there, although I cannot say the same about the weather. As I mentioned, this massive snow. I remember it was the May long weekend. I was flying to Nova Scotia. The day before, I think it was May 21, the day before in Halifax, I had a record high of 36 degrees. I was waiting in St. John's for my wife to come home with the car to drive me to the airport. We had a snowstorm. She got the car stuck in the driveway in a bank. She walked in with our two kids, who were like 1 and 2 at the time, tears streaming. I'm leaving you and moving back to Victoria. And that kind of almost sums up the weather. Although I know it's a month later. In late June, we were shoveling the driveway of snow, and in the back of the house where there was sun, we were mowing the backyard, and that's kind of the weather in Newfoundland. Now in a C-49, as I mentioned, that everywhere I've lived, I run into people from Newfoundland, but they want to get back to the rock, but they want good jobs. And C-49, I do not see delivering that. There's quite a few flaws with C-49. I want to go over some of them. Now, Section 19 of C-49 would open the door to more red tape and lengthy delays. Now, we've heard repeatedly about lack of investment, lack of productivity in this country. It's like 15 to 20 years to get a mine approval, years to get housing approval. In Alberta, we see people not wanting to invest in the country because they know the red tape and the approval process is so slow. Section 19 is going to add to that, discourage investment. It would shift decision-making power on license approvals to the federal and provincial ministers while tripling the amount of time the decision can take. The government often talks about, well, we need experts to make the decisions. And yet, this bill will put power away from experts and regulators in the hands of a very partisan and biased resource minister. Can you imagine anyone involved in resource investment in this country looking at our current resource or environment minister or natural resources minister saying, geez, that looks like a great place I want to invest because I can trust their opinion? No, of course not. Now, Section 28 would give the federal minister, with approval of the provincial minister, the power to outright ban drilling in certain areas and even halt projects that are already approved and in progress. Sounds a bit like Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain. Approved, we're going to spend billions of dollars to find out that the government can retroactively change the rules on you. Again, who wants to invest in this environment? Who wants to create good jobs with this kind of environment? If the bill were to pass with Section 28 as written, it would put an end to offshore petroleum drilling in Atlantic Canada, killing good-paying jobs for workers and further strengthening Eastern Canada's dependence on foreign oil imports from dictatorships like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Now, we've seen how this government treats resource projects in this country. Section 61 and 62 will invariably be abused by the government and attach so many strings to approval that projects become unfeasible. Energy East, anyone? Remember? Here we have TransCanada ready to spend billions of dollars so we can bring Alberta oil, Saskatchewan oil out east and get the eastern provinces off of U.S. oil and off of dictator oil. Instead, the government throws up so many roadblocks, changes the goalposts so many times, they end up canceling the project. Section 61 and 62 would bring the unconstitutional C-69 into the review process, allowing the minister to attach any conditions they see fit to an approval. Now, sections from the Impact Assessment Act, previously 69, also known as the No New Pipeline Bill, in C-49, are put into C-49. On October 13, 2023, the Supreme Court ruled C-69 largely unconstitutional. Federal government has not fixed those sections to date. If C-49 is passed as written, it will include 32 references to sections of C-69 that the Supreme Court identified as unconstitutional. C-49 also includes the discretionary decision-making power of the minister and the entirety of the designated project scheme, both of which are unconstitutional. So components of C-49 may also be unconstitutional. Section C-64 of C-69, deemed unconstitutional, referenced throughout C-49, allows the minister to interfere in a project they think is in the public interest and create any conditions they deem necessary to which the project proponent must comply. Now, we in Alberta know full well what this government does to resource projects. We know full well how they work against resource projects. Of course, we had C-50, the so-called just transition, which we call the unjust transition bill, would be absolutely devastating to Alberta. I want to give you some numbers from the conference board put together. C-50 would destroy 91,000 jobs in Alberta. That's a 58% increase in Alberta's jobless rate. A decline in our GDP of almost 4%. A 50% bigger hit than the 2008 financial crisis. And Alberta revenue would be chopped up to $127 billion over 10 years. That's almost a 20% drop in per year. We've seen very clear this Liberal government's intention toward our natural resources. It's kill it at all costs, send Canadians into poverty, hurt Alberta, hurt out Newfoundland, hurt resource-producing provinces, which is why we will not vote for C-49. Thank you, Madam Speaker.